In this session, we're going to discuss marketing research. What is marketing research? So marketing research is the process that can help us understand some of the factors we just discussed. So for example, it can help us understand what are the needs and wants of our customers, what would they value, what would they consider as benefits, and what they would consider as cost, which is what sometimes we will refer to as consumer insights, understanding things that maybe are not obvious to the eye unless you really do marketing research. And that will help us then serve customers better and give them exactly what they want. So let's look at the marketing information system. So the marketing information system have a few things that we want to look at. One is the marketing environment. So that we actually just covered. Marketing environment, when we do research, is actually doing a situation analysis. So this will be looking at the SWOT, and this will be scanning the environment and looking at the different factors. Then we also have marketing managers and other information users that might benefit from our research. They might be able to also help us gain customer and market insight, as well as use it for themselves. Now, all of these, as you can see, have interactions among themselves because none of them are working by themselves. They're all one big system. One of the things, though, that we are going to concentrate on now is the marketing information system. So what is actually the marketing information system, and what are the sources that we have as marketers to gain consumer insights? So the first one is internal databases. Internal databases are actually databases that I can get from my own company. Today, it will be usually electronic collection of data. So that will be what we call sometimes big data analysis. Big data analysis is when I can get information, let's say, about sales, about returns, about why consumers preferred to buy one product versus another. If you're online, maybe why a consumer put products in the cart, but actually never checked out. So those can be internal databases that I can use. Another source of information is what we call marketing intelligence. Now, marketing intelligence is a bit more complicated than internal database because usually I will actually need to collect the data and then do some analysis. Now, some of this is information that's already there because sometimes we have companies, marketing research companies, that just create research, let's say about the auto industry trends, about eating habit trends and so forth. And sometimes competitors created marketing research and allowed it to be public. And sometimes we ourselves had marketing research that we did in the past, and maybe we can use it in the future. And then the third source is actual marketing research. This is the most difficult one to do, but then probably the most accurate and the one that can provide us with the most insight. And this is where we actually design the marketing research, we collect the data, we analyze it, and it is specifically relevant to whatever situation we want to learn about. Now, why do we need to do marketing research? Why can't we just go by intuition? So one of the first things is that sometimes we really don't understand what is going on. One of the classic examples is that the company sees that the sales are down, demand is down, people are not buying the product, but they can't understand why. So in that sense, the sales are down is not the problem. That's a symptom that something is wrong. A little bit like when someone is sick and they have a fever, the fever is not the sickness, the fever is the symptom, then we have to go to the doctor who does some research to understand why someone has a fever. So the same is here. So we want to understand what changed in the market. Is there a new competitor coming in? Is demand changed? Just like with Ford, suddenly consumers want unique cars and the price is no longer a factor, and so forth. Then the other reason we would like to do marketing research is because it helps us make decisions. So let's say we want to add a new product. We want to do brand extension. Let's say Diet Coke wants to come up with Coke Zero. How do I know if this is a good decision? So again, I want to at least run this idea by my consumers to see how they react before I go out and just create the new product, which, if not successful, can cost me a lot of money. In addition, we also want to make sure that what we're doing now is still good. So we want to make sure that if we came, let's say, with a new advertisement campaign, and we wanted to increase brand awareness, was that successful? How do we know if the promotion, the commercials that we ran, the social media campaign that we did, how do we know that it actually achieved the goals that it was supposed to achieve? So marketing research can help us do that. We also want to know better how to serve customers because, again, as you remember from the Ford example, the market keeps changing all the time. So the fact my customers are happy now doesn't mean they will be happy next year. And what happens if the competition does research, pick up on the fact that there's something better that they can offer, and we are staying behind because we didn't research it and we weren't able to gain consumer insights. So then how do we do that? How do we do research? So of course here we only have a big overall because the marketing research can be a whole course by itself. But these are like the basics. So the basic steps are basically three. One is to define the type of research. So we will talk in a second what kind of research are available to us. And then also, what do we want to gain from that research? Do I want to understand why sales are down? Or do I want to understand why sales are down and also how to solve it? Those are two different objectives. Then once I understand that, I want to think about, well, what is the research plan? How am I planning to collect my information? There are different tools that are out there and are available to me. And then the final step is to actually collect the data and analyze it. Now, obviously, when I analyze the data, I need to understand what are the objectives and how the information was collected. So let's talk more now about step one. So what types of research and objectives are available to us? So in any kind of marketing research, we have three types: exploratory, descriptive, and causal. Exploratory research is when I'm not really sure what is happening. So this will be a good example when sales are down, but I don't understand why they're down. So I need to explore. Just by the nature of the name, we now understand why it's called exploratory research. Let's assume that I explore, let's say I do a focus group, and it seems that maybe our competitor is offering the same product at a lower price. So now I have the solution, and in this point, maybe I don't need to do additional research. All I need is to reduce the price. However, what happens if the reason is that suddenly the benefits of the product are not good enough, and now I want to offer a new product that maybe will compensate for what the old one can't offer. So this can bring us to what we call descriptive research. Descriptive research, again from its name, it's about describing factors. So I want to know what consumers like and don't like. Maybe what's their demographic? What is their attitude toward different brands? How many units they're going to buy if I offer this new product, and so forth. So basically, it helps me to describe the situation, describe the environment. And then the last type of research is causal research. Now, causal research is very unique because what it does, it tests the idea of cause and effect. For example, what will happen if I reduce the price of my product by 30%? Will sales go up, not change, or maybe even go down? If you're a luxury product, sometimes offering a discount is not a good idea. But the cause and effect means that I'm, the company, am changing something in the environment, and as a result, there will be consequences, there will be outcome. And that's why we call it causal, because it's cause and effect. Now, the second stage is about developing the research plan. So at this point, I already decided if I'm doing exploratory, descriptive, or causal. I always have to choose one. I can start with exploratory, then go to descriptive. I can start with descriptive and do causal. However, I do need to understand which one I'm doing first. I also understand the objective. Why am I doing the marketing research? So at this point, these are clear to me. And now I want to say, well, how am I going to collect the information? So there's actually two ways one can collect information. One is secondary data, and one is primary data. Secondary data is basically taking data from somewhere else. Doesn't matter if it's from my own internal resources or from outside of the company. For example, I'm buying research that was already done by someone else, like Nielsen, when I'm looking at media habits. Or I can also just find scholar academic marketing papers that can help me with the theory. Primary data, on the other hand, is information that I myself collected for the specific purpose of whatever objectives I had. Now, obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages of each. So the advantage of having secondary data is that it always will cost me less. Doing primary research is always more expensive. Also, secondary data is right there, so it doesn't take me a long time to collect the data. And on some rare occasions, it's the only way I can actually collect data. So if I'm using Nielsen and media habits, there's really no other way to collect that type of data, if not through a media company. However, the problems or the disadvantages of secondary data as compared to primary data is that it's not always current because it was collected before. So what if it's 3 years, 5 years, 6 years? Is that still relevant to the market today? Because as we say, consumers change, markets change. Is it still relevant? Is it relevant to what I'm looking for? So for example, I can see that in the automobile industry, technology is very important. But does that mean that it's also very important when I'm buying a new vacuum cleaner? Can I make that comparison? Also, the accuracy is sometimes questionable. Who actually collected the data? Who were the respondents that responded to the data? I had no control over it, so I don't know whether it was done properly or not. And then it's also impartial in the sense that when it's collected for me in primary data, then I know there was no agenda in trying to find the data. So for example, if a company, let's say a nonprofit company, that wants to show that being green is better or eating organic is better, sometimes they will do research that will help them prove their point. In that sense, they're not impartial because they do have an agenda. So if I'm a food product company, let's say Kraft, then I need to pay attention to how the data was collected and whether it was objective or was actually trying to show a trend that might or might not actually exist in real life. So this is just a nice diagram to sort of help us summarize what we discussed so far. So we have secondary and we have primary. Now within secondary, as you can see, we have internal sources and we have external sources. Again, both of them are considered secondary data. Why? Because they were collected not for the purpose of my research. So even though the fact that I collected them myself in internal sources, it is still considered as secondary data. That's an important point to remember. Then in primary data, we have observation, we have surveys, interviews, and focus groups, and we have experiments. We will discuss this a little bit later because those will fit the type of research I decided to use, exploratory, descriptive, or causal. So now we're at the final stage of collecting and analyzing the data. So we understood whether we're using secondary or primary, or as sometimes happens, we will use both. We will start with secondary, then we will see what are we missing, and then we'll add primary if needed. So we have to decide, is it exploratory, descriptive, or causal? We have to decide, are we using observations, surveys, or experiments? So as you can understand, exploratory works more on observations. It works more on focus groups and interviews. Descriptive usually will work very well with surveys, but it can also work with observation depending what type. And causal will work on what we call experiments. For example, we can have one store with 30% discount, another store with no discount, and we can see whether sales had an effect on whether one store had a discount versus the other. It's very easy, for example, to do online, where you can just, some consumers who go into the website will get a 30% discount, while some will not. Also, we need to try to think, well, how are we actually going to contact the respondent? Are we going to use mail? Are we going to use the phone? Are we going to use an online survey method, and so forth? And then also the sampling plan. Who is going to participate? And finally, are we going to use a paper and pencil? Are we going to use an electronic device? Are we going to have a person who's going to interview you and fill the survey for you? And so forth. So then, let's discuss a bit further what we talked about observation. So observational research is when basically you're gathering the primary data by observing people. So you can observe traffic patterns. For example, you can see what are the times that there are more traffic, less traffic. Should we put a stop sign? Should we put a red light or a green light? But you can also look at consumption patterns. For example, you can see when a parent goes into a store with a child, how much effect does the child have on what type of cereal they're going to choose, or what type of milk or juice they're going to choose. And you can just observe either by looking without being noticed, or actually by using the surveillance camera of the supermarket. A lot of supermarkets do that. Ethnographic research is a specific observational type of research. In this case, you actually send the marketing researcher, the observer, to someone's home, and they basically shadow them to try to see what is that the consumer does with the product. So Folgers at the time, in the 60s, actually did an ethnographic research trying to see how people drink their coffee. And one of the things they found out was that the smell of coffee in the morning is what makes people happy about coffee. So that's where they came with the idea that you have Folgers in your cup, and all of their commercials were about people waking up to the smell of their coffee machine already brewing. Another big ethnographic research is what we call cool hunting. Cool hunting is something that companies, like Nike for example, always want to know, well, what is the next trend? How do I know what is the next trend? So I follow people who are cool, and I try to see what they wear, how do they behave. And by doing that, I'm trying then to imitate it and put it into my products. A survey research, on the other hand, is when I have a questionnaire. And this is, as I mentioned before, is very appropriate to descriptive research because it's really helpful when I want to know attitudes, preferences, and buying behavior. And all the respondents are getting exactly the same questions, so it's very easy for me to also analyze the data. Unlike observational research, where there's a lot of subjective interpretation based on who is observing the data. And finally, experimental research, as we mentioned before, is the type of research that fits really well with cause and effect. One of the big things that companies sometimes want to see is what's going to happen if they're going to change their logo. Starbucks, for example, changed their logo through the years. Gap tried to change their logo a few years ago and actually changed it back because it didn't go well. So changing a logo is cause and effect. Will that affect how people will perceive the brand? Whether they will have different attitudes toward the brand, and so forth. So what kind of research approaches and type of data we have? So in addition to primary and secondary, we also have what we call qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative research is when I get very deep type of information, very rich information, but it's not something I can really analyze on a statistical level. So we mentioned before focus groups or interviews. So those will be getting data from a few consumers, but those consumers, you spend a lot of time with them and you speak to them. And for example, when I do exploratory research, I want to know why sales are down. Having a conversation can be very insightful. So for that, qualitative research can be very good and fit. The advantage is, as I mentioned, is that it gives me a lot of richness because I can continue to ask, but why? Why is that cool? Why wearing an earring instead of a necklace makes something cool? I can dig deeper. The problem is that because it's such a few amount of people, The fact that, let's say, 6 people think something is cool, does that mean that the rest of the target market thinks something is cool? The other problem is it really depends on the moderator. It depends on the person on how they interpret the data, because we cannot really use statistical analysis in order to analyze the data. So the other type of research can be quantitative research. Quantitative research I can use to supplement to qualitative, or I can use just quantitative. And this will be when I need additional information. Now, the tools that quantitative research use is big data analysis, so that will be the internal digital sources that we have. It will be questionnaires. It will be any kind of method that will allow me to collect a large sample and be able to be consistent across the sample, so everybody will answer exactly the same scale, the same questions, and the same method of answers. The last topic that I want to discuss is the sampling. Meaning, so who is going to get those questionnaires? Who is going to be on the focus group? So a sample is basically a segment of the population that we decide we're going to do the marketing research on. So who is going to be surveyed? So for example, if I'm doing something about being cool, maybe age can be appropriate. Maybe lifestyle can be appropriate. How many people should I survey? Should I do 3 or 4 focus groups or only 1? Should I ask 1,000 people or 500 people? And how should the people be chosen? How can I choose which one I'm going to ask and which one I'm not going to ask? Now, for the purpose of this course, this is sort of enough. Obviously, again, when you do a marketing research course, you go much deeper into these questions and also provide a much more scientific answers.